The McGrady Group. The best questions, the best answers.
Welcome to the McGrady Group. I'm Ian McGrady. In light of recent events in the White House, we're focusing on the big legal questions. What's the difference between collusion and treason with regards to an event people are calling the Russian hack of the U.S. presidential election? But I'm also going to consider whether it's more than just a hack. We're opening our discussion with Professor Steven Vladeck, an author of Aspen Publishers' textbook Legal Guide to National Security Law and also their Guide to Counterterrorism Law, which is used by universities and military academies and others who need to consider answers to these questions that we're confronting daily in our headlines. He's a graduate of Amherst and Yale Law and is presently professor of law at the University of Texas School of Law. Good morning, Professor Vladeck.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And also this morning's McGrady Group is Frederick Baker, a political theorist with more than 20 years in finance, Jeffrey Bolden, a systems integration and data conversion specialist, and a partner at Blue Lotus Systems Integration and Data Conversion, and our Russian affairs correspondent, Scott Lacamelli. Good morning, and let's get started. Professor Vladeck, welcome. My first question is, your books were updated in February and March of 2016, specifically with chapters on cyber warfare, bulk data collection, and data mining. What made you decide at that time that those would become pressing issues for the new editions of those legal guides?
It had been 5 years. The previous editions of both books had come out in 2011. And frankly, I mean, without any regard to President Trump, a lot had happened in those 5 years. I mean, the Edward Snowden disclosures and all of the concomitant scandal that accompanied them, a lot of, much more aggressive cyber operations by Russia, by China, by other actors. And so when we sat down to update the 2011 editions, it seemed obvious and natural to devote a good chunk of the new material to those significant developments that had, really dominated the headlines for the better part of 2013, 2014, and 2015.
Professor Vladeck, there are several elements to the Russian hack of the presidential election of 2016. It looks to me like we're facing a basket of Russian influence that affected the outcome of the 2016 election. So is this more than just a hack, and does it fall somewhere between hack and cyber warfare in your view? Because it's hard to say that these things are happening coincidentally, and they all sort of feature the same two groups of players. You have the Kremlin and the White House, and all of these things are sort of landing between them and look like they were happening in roughly the same time period.
It's certainly more than a hack. I mean, I think, anytime a foreign government is seeking to interfere with a domestic election, obviously, I think that's more than just, a cyber attack where someone steals data from someone else. The tricky part is that I'm skeptical about jumping all the way to cyber warfare because, election interference, as much as a threat to democratic norms as it is and as alarmed as we should be by it, is really not the kind of hostile action that, involving the uses of force that we've historically equated with warfare. I do think, though, the terminology shouldn't take away from the significance. I think this is a significant and serious threat to our most basic and fundamental democratic norms. We have a whole bunch of regulations and criminal laws that sort of map on to what we think happened in 2016, but we actually, I think, have never squarely confronted the possibility that a foreign government might so directly try to interfere in our electoral process. And to me, whatever else one thinks of President Trump, this to me is what Congress really needs to be thinking about going forward. Should we have laws that are much more specifically targeted at that kind of activity as such?
Jeff, you had a question for the professor.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. When the types of hacking that occurred in terms of influence of the election on Facebook, the most effective appears to be the stuff that was targeted at Bernie Sanders supporters in getting them not to switch over to supporting Hillary, to still feel very iffy about her. Is there that kind of social media influencing is considered a legitimate part of American advertising? I mean, it's ultimately the purpose of advertising is to influence purchase decisions by, broad numbers of consumers. Are there any laws regarding a foreign power doing this, engaging in this kind of behavior? And more importantly, are there any laws regarding assisting a foreign power in engaging in this sort of behavior? I mean, if we say that this kind of behavior, while aggressive, was legal, was it illegal? Would it be illegal even if proven if the Trump administration had colluded with the Russian intelligence in utilizing our advertising industry to influence American political opinion?
I mean, so I think we need to separate out those 2 points because they are different. And I think the key that folks need to understand is that there are, in fact, a series of laws that are part of our campaign finance and our election laws that actually do prohibit most kinds of direct foreign participation and foreign interference in elections. Now, it's possible, if we ever got to a prosecution of a Russian, hacktivist for this kind of activity, it's possible they would say, listen, I wasn't trying to influence the election as such. I was trying to influence public debate in the United States. That of itself is not illegal. I don't know how well the argument would go. But as significant as that is, I think the far more significant legal restraint, and the one we've heard a lot about in the aftermath of the news of Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting, is the restraint on U.S. political campaigns, including the Trump campaign, receiving assistance from any foreign national. It doesn't even have to be a foreign government when it comes to elections where the assistance is, quote, substantial, unquote, and where the assistance comes in the form of a donation of money or anything of value. And so I think one of the real questions here is whether, insofar as the Russian government and elements thereof were involved in this campaign to boost the Trump campaign, how much of that was with the knowledge of the Trump campaign, with the active encouragement and support of the Trump campaign, to the point where those kinds of laws might come into play. Guys, frankly, I don't think we know enough yet to answer that question, but there's certainly enough here to want to run that down.
Scott, you had a question as well for Professor Vladeck.
Professor, I agree with you. Obviously, this is so early, and the investigation is so closed in the sense that there's no information really coming out other than sporadic or what seem to be systematic leaks coming out, to the press. Other than that, we don't really know whether there is any legal argument that's being formed, what it might be, on what grounds, using which legal precedents or existing laws or rules in our political and legal system. So I guess I was wondering if you could just provide us with a brief overview of the different potential areas where we might see some sort of legal activity. And I guess I can kind of highlight in my mind, what I see. So one option would be, is there the issue of high treason as a potential offense here? And my immediate read, based on the Constitution, is no, because we are not at war with Russia, and treason charges only apply in the case of, a scenario where you were at war with another nation state. So I was just curious if you could speak to that. Secondly, would there be grounds for bringing up issues of sedition or the Smith Act or its derivatives that have evolved over time in terms of Trump team's collusion with the Russian government to, quote unquote, overthrow or undermine our government? But of course, the issue there is it's not through violence, it's through cyber warfare and human intelligence activities that they've, have achieved this. You could argue was an overthrow of our government, but it was done indirectly without violence and using, intelligence and, signals and human intelligence methods that are typical Russian and Soviet practices. And then the third angle would be, are there grounds to look at conspiracy to commit espionage? We all know, some of the famous cases such as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, where they provided nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union and were tried and convicted for conspiracy to commit espionage. Is that an angle that might evolve? And then finally, is there a case, or rather in terms of the easiest path to impeachment for Trump, would it simply just be obstruction of justice? And in my mind, that seems to be the easiest item to prove potentially, because the first three are so convoluted and difficult to corroborate potentially, and also because of the legal sort of lack of clarity that you kind of alluded to in your opening comments. So I was wondering if you could just kind of speak to those 4 points and where you think an investigation might go, and from your legal perspective, what is realistic in terms of what might happen?
I think it would probably be most helpful to break the potential criminal offenses into 4 categories, although I might tweak the categories a bit from how you frame them. So, let's start with treason. I think you're right. I think treason is it sounds good coming off the tongue, but it's just not really in the cards here. And that has nothing to do with the nature of the relationship between the Trump campaign and Russia, and everything to do with the fact that we're not at war with Russia. Now, I know a lot of folks will say, well, wait a second, Russia is cyber attacking us, Russia is trying to interfere with our elections. If that's not war, what is? The problem is that I think we have to be very careful about, bandying the word treason and war around, because the whole purpose of writing treason into the Constitution was to prevent it from being construed expansively as a tool that could potentially be used to go after political opponents. And that's why, historically, courts have limited it to levying war against the United States in the classical sense, or adhering to their enemies in the sense of countries with which we are at war. So Russia, I think, is out. The second category, I think, is this sort of espionage bucket of offenses. That's closer. It doesn't require war. There have been a number of quote-unquote peacetime prosecutions under the Espionage Act. The tricky part there is the Espionage Act is all sort of founded upon the unauthorized sharing of national security information. Not clear to me that the Trump campaign, as of the time any of this collusion may have happened, actually had national security information to share. We're not talking about the Trump campaign saying, oh, hey, here's information about U.S. agents stationed in Russia. Espionage, I think, also doesn't quite work, at least based on what we know so far. Some folks have thrown out this really old statute called the Logan Act. The Logan Act is a 1799 law that makes it a crime for private citizens, which, let's remember, until January, the Trump campaign was to try to sort of directly interfere with American foreign relations and to defeat the measures of the United States. I think that's a better fit topically and textually. The problem with the Logan Act is it's never been used. And in fact, there are serious First Amendment questions about it because it's effectively prohibiting a very specific kind of speech based on its content. The Supreme Court doesn't really like those kinds of laws anymore. So, I think that's a better fit, but only sort of theoretically. So that's the second bucket. The third bucket is one that doesn't get enough attention, which is the panoply of laws that deal with foreign influence. So we've talked a bit about the campaign finance laws and the election laws that, prohibit direct foreign participation in elections. But there are also, there's a statute called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which we've already heard a bit about in the context of Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn, where individuals who are carrying out political activities on behalf of a foreign power, and that doesn't have to be a foreign government, it could be a foreign corporation, actually have to register with the Justice Department and report those activities. Seems pretty clear that Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort, at least, did not comply with this statute, at least initially. They've both filed belated after the fact foreign agent registrations. I think there are still really important questions about whether those belated registrations were complete and accurate in all respects, and whether anybody else needed to file such a statement, Jared Kushner perhaps. And then, guys, the last bucket, and I do think this is where all of the attention is going to end up, is, for lack of a better term, what we might call the cover-up crimes. The cover-up so often is really worse than the original crime. So the cover-up crimes include, as you say, obstruction of justice, when the president fires the FBI director because he doesn't like the progress of an investigation into his campaign. That seems to me to come pretty close to obstruction of justice. But it also includes, I think, the far less controversial federal false statements statute, 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, which makes it a felony to lie to federal investigators or to lie on federal government paperwork that you sign under penalty of perjury. And that includes, for example, the forms that one fills out when they're applying for a security clearance. So, I don't know where this story is going to end, but I really do think that the cover-up crimes are going to be the ones that are the most attractive to the special counsel, Bob Mueller and his team, because I think they're going to be the easiest to prove. I think they're going to be the sort of the ones with the best precedents, and, the ones with the sort of fewest, super, obvious contrary and countervailing arguments. But who knows where this particular train is going to end up.
Let's assume that it was going in the direction of obstruction of justice and the other federal, false statement issues, regarding the filing of these forms, et cetera. They're felony charges. But in the case of Trump, let's assume that obstruction of justice related to the firing of Comey was front and center, for example. Can a sitting president be prosecuted, or would it require impeachment first? I'm just curious from your constitutional law perspective how you view that.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth stressing. The constitutional law scholars are actually divided on this question. And they're divided on this question because, it depends really to some degree on how you interpret Article 2 and sort of the power of the prosecutor, which is currently being wielded by Bob Mueller. Bob Mueller may be sort of quasi-independent, but he's not actually structurally independent. I mean, if President Trump wanted to get rid of the special counsel, he could. And so I think the reality is that the academic debate is just about immaterial because there's no mechanism to prevent a president from stopping such a prosecution. And so as a practical matter, even if not as a constitutional matter, it's not really going to be possible for a president to be prosecuted by his own Justice Department while he's the president, while they answer to him. That's why historically, right, the approach anytime we've gotten this close to concerns about a president committing these kinds of offenses has been to kick the matter to the House of Representatives and let them consider obstruction of justice. And guys, I mean, let's remind everybody, the last two times the House seriously considered impeachment charges, and in the case of Bill Clinton actually voted them out, obstruction of justice was front and center.
Fred, I wanted to ask you, it seems like so much of this is new territory, and you basically have the left saying, this is real, this is an issue, look at all these things that are happening. And on the right, they're adopting very much a sort of wait-and-see attitude. Is the right treating this basically as a partisan issue and not a constitutional crisis?
I think in general, and my contacts with folks that are in Republican leaders' offices, in D.C. and in some of the states say that this is really being considered more of a partisan issue than virtually anything else. That this kind of data, again and again we're told, they didn't have anything, or they weren't, they were just having an open discussion about things. The idea that we could prove some sort of collusionary effort, I think, becomes very, very difficult, and certainly I think in most Republican minds, it's basically not going to happen. And because of that, then, what we're really looking at is, how far is the Justice Department going to go? And I think with Mr. Sessions at the helm, not very. And I think everybody agrees with that. And then on the sort of broader issue of obstruction, that's kind of the only thing out there. And I think so far it's been pretty easy for folks to say, well, this is just Trump and Trump's people being Trump. And that seems to, get everybody the pass they need to pretend nothing happened. Me personally, I feel like something probably happened, that there was some sort of collusion or what have you. Certainly this whole idea that you have to register as somebody who works with a foreign power, I think it's been treated very cavalierly. But again, it's been treated very cavalierly by Washington insiders and people that Washington insiders want to curry a tremendous amount of favor from. So I really don't feel like this is being taken particularly seriously as a nonpartisan issue. I think as a partisan issue, many of the folks that I speak with do treat it very seriously because they do see that this is a substantial issue on most people's minds, that it is preventing them from getting a lot of things done, and that they've got a lot of explaining to do in terms of, where they were and when and why and that sort of thing, that they really don't want to have to address. The idea that it could be many more people that is currently involved is again, something that I think a lot of folks are thinking about. But keep in mind that most of these people on the House, on the Hill, in governors' offices, they really have no idea what the Trump campaign is actually up to. And I say campaign, the Trump administration is actually up to. There's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of conjecture, but these are not people who are involved in the sort of day-to-day decisions. But yet they're being called upon to explain them and defend them. And they can't do either of those things particularly well. That's where I think the right stands with this whole process.
I think it's still early. And so I agree with all of that, but I think, a lot can still happen. Keep in mind, there is an ongoing Senate Intelligence Committee investigation. Chairman Richard Burr from North Carolina has been quite direct that, without regard to the Trump administration specifically, he's very interested in getting to the bottom of Russia's involvement in the election. There's the special counsel. Bob Mueller has surrounded himself with a fantastic and top-flight team of lawyers. I'd be very surprised if that investigation doesn't lead to at least some indictments. And so, listen, if we get, indictments out of a special counsel, if we get a Senate Intelligence Committee investigation that shows more than we already know, I wouldn't assume that there's going to be at least some pushback from the more moderate elements of the Republican Party. We have no evidence to believe that's going to happen yet, but keep in mind, even 2 weeks before he resigned, President Nixon's approval rating was still in the low 30s, right? So I don't know that we should jump to the conclusion that there's just nothing that can animate the Republican base into action here. I just think it's going to take more than what we have so far, right? That it's still early, and there's a lot left to go, and a lot's going to come down to what happens with the special counsel, what happens with the Senate Intelligence Committee, and how those results are really sort of accepted by the Republican establishment in Washington and by Republican voters at home. And I think that's going to be the real driver going forward.
I think one thing that was interesting this week is that we saw a Fox News commentator go off on the Trump administration. I believe it was Shepard Smith in one of his segments was talking about lie after lie of the Trump administration, I think particularly regarding this meeting. And I think that that's quite telling. I don't think that type of comment would be on the air, so to speak, unless perhaps conservative America is being prepared at the very early stages for perhaps a different interpretation of the Russia-Trump events forthcoming. So I think that's kind of interesting to see. Given how important media, news, tweets, TV, sound bites, all these things are, that's a very important sound bite in my mind, because I think it's, we're obviously looking for that Watergate inflection point, where you begin to have Republican defections from Team Trump, and I think clearly that's a potential indication that popular, or rather that the, sort of the national audience is being prepared perhaps. It could have been a one-off comment, who knows? But it just was quite interesting, I thought, quite telling.
I totally agree. I mean, I think those are going to be the bellwethers, right? Whether, folks who have to this point been adamant defenders of the president and his campaign, whether any of them really start to turn. I'm not holding my breath that Sean Hannity is going to see the light, but this is not just about Sean Hannity. This is about moderate House Republicans who are up for election next November. It's about moderate Senate Republicans, who have to run on something either in November or in 2020. So, I think folks should be careful to assume that just because nothing has happened yet, that nothing is going to happen.
I think that's very fair. Yes, I mean, there are a lot of folks that are up for re-election that have to sort of thread the needle between being a tough Republican and being somebody who has, sort of a basic grasp of the obvious. I do agree that Shepard Smith's comments were very telling. And it's something that we've seen, I think, on an increasing rate over the last couple of weeks from outlets like the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, et cetera. Will Hannity come around? Will Breitbart News start castigating Trump? Probably not anytime soon. However, there are certainly a lot of Republicans out there that are really, really upset.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Vladeck. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
At what point does the axe drop on lies in this presidency?
I have this image in my head that a video that a colleague of mine took out in the New York City seaport, where a tugboat was not fully freed from a cruise ship as it started to steam away. You're supposed to cast off all the lines once you're ready to go, but in this case they did not. And the poor little tugboat really is no match for a cruise ship. and the tugboat was sort of spun around and started to be literally rolled underneath the waves, just because of this cruise ship started moving away too fast. And the tug ship had gotten the ship into position, but was moving along, and then they just were never freed from the line. And thinking quickly, a gentleman on the stern of the tugboat picked up the safety axe and literally chopped the line. So at what point, does the Republican rank and file, as well as some key members of Republican leadership, chop the line and say, you know what, this steamship is headed for the rocks, and we are not a part of it? I think you're starting to see bits and pieces of that already. There are a number of Republican senators that have nothing but negative comments for the administration, and I think that's telling. That wears on people, and I think it's kind of on an ongoing process that the more of this sort of half-truths and late belated registrations of foreign powers and that sort of thing come out, the more likely people are to say these guys are completely off the rails. Can they sort of remake American politics in their image? It's possible, but I think it's increasingly less likely. So I think that's an ongoing path that people are taking, but I also believe that it's something that is at an increasing rate.
I thought that his comments on something of value from a foreigner in terms of to influence an election was really interesting. I'd like to explore that one a little bit more because I think that does make a lot of sense. I've always thought that the Logan Act, I agree with his comment about the Logan Act, that the Logan Act is just not going to be enforceable. The number of Americans who on a daily basis disagree with foreign policy and don't act in concert with it is enormous. I mean, there's simply no way to enforce the Logan Act, but I think that's something of value for a foreigner. I thought that's a key point, and I kind of wanted to dig into that a little bit more if anybody's got any comments.
I mean, my expectation is that, there are probably a lot of people that are working with foreign governments or foreign companies on behalf of lobbying efforts or, just sort of making contacts with people in government and who don't register because they don't view what they're doing as sort of material. It's possible that some of them have not been introduced to the Logan Act or that sort of thing. But I just feel like it's, in general, it's just not a material issue, and nobody will take it particularly seriously. I mean, if I have contacts with a company in China, that's nobody really cares. If the company in China with which I have contact is owned by the People's Revolutionary Army, and I've actively helped them buy military components factories here in the United States, then it becomes more of an issue. But I may not want to do any registering of any kind until I'm ready to ink documents on the sale of the factory in the U.S.
Okay, so I mean, I guess if we're in agreement that the Logan Act is unlikely, then we can sort of then I think we can, as a consensus, dismiss that. Because I mean, it sounds like we have a consensus on that even though the media constantly talks about it, it just ain't happening. Yeah, exactly. I think the obstruction of justice becomes kind of the only issue. How easy to prove is that? I'm not entirely certain, but it seems like in both police procedurals as well as in ongoing fraud trials with other people in government, Sheldon Silver, et cetera, here in New York, that obstruction is one of the main and one of the early charges they go for. We asked you for the information, you said you didn't have it, it turned out you did, obstruction.
Jeff, in terms of the hack, is that something of value, and could they have done this legally, or is the incremental value that they got by going to the Kremlin so important to the campaign that they absolutely had to have it in order to win? And could they have paid for the same information?
It's an interesting question, and I think that there's two different things. There's the information and what they did with the information. So the first thing that's important to understand is it's not like they were just passively collecting intelligence. They were passively collecting intelligence on American voters. They were passively collecting intelligence on American voters, and then actively utilizing that intelligence and information to influence public opinion. So there was both an information collection and an ongoing, broad-based, let's call it political advertising campaign that was being conducted by the Russians directly. Okay, there definitely are companies that sell those sorts of services. It's done all the time for products. You collect information about people who are discussing the product, and you start to inject interest. Arguably, Google is a champion of this. Facebook is a champion of this. I mean, it really became the next generation of advertising. America's always been great. You know, the combination of advertising and technology really hit America's sweet spot, which is why the United States is really, you know, arguably the global leader in this. You know, Google, Facebook, many of the companies you think of grew out of this sort of thing. So the answer is that we're very good at this. And yes, these sorts of services could have been provided legally. However, there are a couple of things that the Trump campaign did that I think go further than mainstream companies would have done. And they also would have had certain other specific problems. Getting to the biggest problem that they would have had is one of the ways that they harassed people was when Bernie Sanders supporters were in, you know, various private discussion groups, starting to make positive comments about Hillary. In other words, they were, you know, doing this sort of consolidation that happens within a political party. Bots would attack those discussions and disrupt them through either harassment, you know, long strings of vulgarity, or dropping pornography right into the middle of the discussions as images to just break up the conversation and effectively dissuade. In other words, anytime you made a positive comment about Hillary, your favorite chat channel was overwhelmed by disgusting trolls from your perspective. That caused you to be less likely to make positive comments about Hillary, and behavior changes belief. That caused you to be less positive in your thinking about Hillary. I don't think an American company would have dumped pornographic images or engaged in harassment against Americans, particularly with minors present. I mean, the legal consequences of that would have been pretty severe for an American company. It's not to say that they don't know how to do it, but I don't think that you could have bought that service from any American firm that wasn't fairly criminal. So that is pretty much you would have needed a foreign power for.
So the value add for the Trump campaign is that they could go more deep with negative experiences for people who might be inclined to vote for Hillary Clinton.
Yes, they were willing to go harder than I think an American company would in an advertising campaign. You know, Mercedes-Benz might be willing to say slightly negative things about Ford, but it's not going to go into a chat channel where people are talking about how good Ford is, or starting to talk about, you know, I'm thinking about buying my Ford, and dump pornography and obscenity at them. It would work, but, you know, they just wouldn't do it. They wouldn't go that far.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, my experience certainly in the financial world, and I imagine you all can speak to this as well, whenever we were confronted with an opportunity to be sort of negative in public against another similar firm, the answer from the marketing department was always, you know, no, we don't do that. We don't say bad things about our competitors. We say good things about ourselves.
Right, and certainly you wouldn't go that far. Like, anytime somebody tries to say good things about your competitors, let's harass the individual,
right.
Like customers. That's the big one. The second one is that the people they would have had to hire, the people who have the skills in the United States having to do with social data mining of social networks, are disproportionately Democrats. And not only are they disproportionately Democrats, many of them have at least second-degree ties to Obama for America. Because Obama for America actively got, you know, some of the best people in the United States who were involved in mining of social media, involved both in the 2008 and 2012 campaign. I don't know if you could have conducted a large-scale operation like the Trump campaign did, using Americans without OFA, you know, which basically got absorbed by the Hillary campaign, knowing about it. So the Hillary campaign would have known exactly what you were doing because it would have been leaking. These are their close friends who are working for the Hillary campaign. It would have been very, very difficult to isolate at the worker bee level this sort of social media thing from Hillary. So Hillary would have known. And the second point that I would make is surprise was a key element. In other words, one of the things that's really important about this is that the Hillary campaign didn't understand the depth to which they were being attacked during the campaign. They were caught off guard and had to be responding in real time late in the campaign to these various things, never really knowing what was going to happen. Had you used Americans and had, Hillary had a fairly good idea of what they were planning to do 6 months, a year, 2 years ahead of time, she would have been readily prepared for it and could probably have countered it much better. In other words, if somebody handed Hillary a campaign in 2014 and said, hey, you're going to have a tough primary against Bernie Sanders that's going to leave a lot of people, particularly young people, bitter. Those young people are going to be trying, as they try to consolidate around you, they're going to be interfered with by a bunch of bots and social trolls. She very well might have been able to counter that, come up with a counter strategy and be prepared for it. The problem was that she didn't necessarily know what was going on, and when she figured out what was going on, she only had weeks to respond before the election. Finally, and I apologize for this long answer, there's no evidence that Donald Trump had the technical competency to run this sort of thing. I mean, you're talking about something that involves hundreds of highly skilled, educated people working with large quantities of equipment, programming over a sustained period of time, staying in a sustained direction, managing them, dealing with, the problems. I mean, if you think about Trump's managerial skills, he's shown no evidence of being able to coordinate large numbers of highly skilled people in this way, nor has he ever had this kind of technological depth. Now, I would say that there were people associated with the Trump campaign who do have these kinds of skills. The most obvious person is Robert Mercer, who is one of the two founding partners of Renaissance Technologies. That's the organization that both Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway kind of directly that came out of. He does have this sort of, both the data mining of social networks people, not to the extent to do this, but he has those kinds of people on staff, and people who manage them. He could have done this. Large-scale management people like Peter Thal, Carl Icahn, would have those sorts of people on board. But I don't know that Trump ever would have allowed a key component of his campaign to be structurally controlled by one of these billionaires for a period of 2 years. So given that he couldn't manage this himself, given that his kids couldn't manage it, and given that he doesn't trust anybody but his kids for long-term investment in, high up in his management structure in the way that this would have required, I don't know that structurally the Trump campaign could have done it. So that's the other main thing that I think that they're buying from the Russians is competent management.
That's an interesting assessment. Certainly, one of the things I think you can say about Trump as a quote-unquote businessman is that Trump does have a reasonably good ability, or somebody inside the organization does have a reasonably good ability to find individuals who can make a significant contribution to Trump's, I was going to say bottom line, but given the quantity of bankruptcies had, perhaps that's not the right phrase, but certainly made a significant impact to Trump's business endeavors. And perhaps somebody said, great, what we can do here is get the management of this kind of a system from the Russians. Yeah,
I would agree. I mean, I think he's got the ability to get individuals, but the ability to control a large-scale, sophisticated organization. Yeah, you can't just run around yelling how great you are and actually have things happen. And do we all agree that he wouldn't have trusted somebody, kind of a billionaire sort of person like a Carl Icahn, to that degree to manage his campaign, to own permanently and sort of irreplaceably a key component of the campaign? Not going to happen.
Before we wrap up the show, let's just hear very briefly from each of you. What are you looking for in the news next week?
Sorry, this is Frederick Baker, and I'm mostly looking for some sort of follow-through on all of Trump's tough talk on North Korea, and I'm looking with great interest at the continuation of the Affordable Care Act and what changes.
Scott Liccamelli, what are you looking for next week?
Next week, I'll be looking to see if there's any news flow on the Donald Trump Jr. meeting, which took place with various Russian persons of interest. And specifically, I'll be looking at, there was a gentleman who attended the meeting who is a supposedly former Russian intelligence officer, son of a KGB colonel, by the name of Renat Akhmetshin, who is actually who may be connected to Paul Manafort. And I'd be very interested to see if in the coming week we see a pickup in news flow that actually connects those two, because I think it might lead to a more interesting direction in this investigation.
Jeff Bolden, what are you looking for next week?
As ISIS loses, our need for coordination with the Russians in the fight against ISIS diminishes. I suspect that we see more information leak coming out as our hostility towards Iran and our hostility towards Russia can increase. That's what I'd be looking for. And like I said, more over the next quarter than the next week.
Everybody, Scott Liccamelli, Frederick Baker, Jeffrey Bolden, thank you all for forming and participating in the McGrady Group. And everybody at home, look for us on YouTube. Just type in the search box, the McGrady Group, and also we have a Facebook page for the McGrady Group as well. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Music provided by Sunteb. Check them out on SoundCloud. Until next time, on behalf of all of us, thank you.